The backyard was always softer than the rest of the earth, spongy, damp, like it still remembered what had been laid inside it. On summer evenings, when the wind slipped down from the hills, it carried a smell of iron and rot that no one in the family ever mentioned. They'd just close the windows, light the oil lamps, and pretend the air didn't hum. They buried the most inbred girl in that backyard. She was small enough to fit in a flour sack, they said. Born blue, never cried, just stared at her mother with eyes that couldn't decide what color they wanted to be. Some said she had more teeth than a baby ought to. Others swore she didn't have any at all, only a tongue split down the middle like a snake's. The Kettles never took her into town, never brought a preacher out to bless her. They just waited for her to stop breathing. But she didn't. Not really. Sometimes, after midnight, they'd hear her under the floorboards, crawling. And when she finally went still, the family did what they thought was merciful. They dug a hole behind the lilac bushes and laid her down, no coffin, no cross, just dirt and the promise that no one would ever speak her name again. That was 40 years ago. Now, every spring, when the rain turns the soil to mud, something pushes up from beneath the roots. Not all the way, just enough to remind them she's still there, waiting for the right one to come home. It started the way most bad stories do, with a dare. The Kettle place had been empty for decades, crouched at the end of a long dirt road that no one used anymore. The windows were clouded with grime, the paint had long since peeled off in thin white curls, and the porch sagged like the house itself was tired of standing. Every kid in town grew up hearing the same whispered warnings: don't go near the Kettle property after dark, don't step past the fence line, don't look toward the lilac bushes when the wind blows east. But curiosity has a way of sounding braver in a group, especially when the night is hot and the moon is sharp enough to cut. There were 4 of them that night: Milo, Tess, Shane, and little Brooke, armed with a flashlight that barely worked and a bottle of whiskey stolen from somebody's dad. They came for the thrill, for the chance to laugh in the face of whatever old stories their parents still believed. The grass grew waist-high around the porch, thick with burrs and the stink of old water. Every step forward made a sound like breathing. Tess was the first to say she smelled something wrong, like something sweet and spoiled. No one listened. They never do at first. Behind the house, the backyard stretched out into a shallow dip of earth, ringed by the twisted remains of lilac bushes that hadn't bloomed in years. In the middle of them, half hidden under creeping vines, was a rough wooden cross. It leaned slightly to the left, its surface carved with small, uneven lines that didn't look like words, more like scratches made by someone who didn't know what letters were supposed to be. Milo laughed and said maybe it was a pet's grave. Shane kicked at the dirt, and the ground gave a little, softer than it should have been. That was when Brooke noticed the earth moving. Just a twitch at first, the kind of thing you tell yourself is just a trick of the light, but it happened again, the soil trembling as if something underneath was breathing shallow and slow. Tess swore and dropped the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark in a frantic circle before landing on the cross. The wood was wet, glistening in the moonlight, though it hadn't rained in days. Milo crouched down, pressed his hand to the ground, and whispered that he could feel warmth. Shane told him to dig. They didn't dig much, just enough to break the surface, enough for the smell to come. Thick. Sweet. Rotten. It rolled out of the earth like a sigh. The flashlight flickered once, then went out, and for a moment, none of them moved, because something was shifting beneath the soil, slow and deliberate, like it had been waiting for the sound of their voices. By morning, the story had already spread like smoke through the town. People didn't need proof to believe something terrible had happened up at the old Kettle place, they'd been expecting it for years. The Kettle name had always carried a strange weight, a kind of whispered curse that made conversations falter. No one could quite remember when the family had first come to the valley, only that they'd stayed long after everyone else moved closer to town. They lived off their own land, grew their own crops, and married only among themselves. The records showed generations of Kettles, cousins marrying cousins, names repeating like an echo that never faded. It wasn't just rumor, it was tradition, the kind that turned skin pale and eyes wrong. The older folks said the Kettles kept to themselves because they were proud, that they didn't want outsiders meddling in their bloodline. But others whispered something darker, that they weren't protecting their name so much as containing it. There were stories of strange births, of children who didn't live past their first winters, of babies who cried with voices too deep for their size. Some swore that on quiet nights, you could hear lullabies drifting through the hills, sung in a language no one could recognize. The family never attended church, never came to town fairs or funerals, and when the last Kettle boy did show his face in public, his hands were covered in fresh bandages and his eyes twitched at every sound. The sheriff used to joke that the Kettles were more legend than people, a patch of bad soil that refused to grow anything clean. But the librarian, Mrs. Norrie, remembered them well. She said she'd seen the mother once, tall, thin, her hair the color of wheat left too long in the field, carrying something small wrapped in a quilt that twitched and shuddered. She came to borrow a book about angels but left with a book about burial rites instead. After that, no one saw her again. When word got around that a group of kids had been snooping around the Kettle yard, the old stories woke up again. The men at the diner talked about the family's purity, but they didn't say the word in admiration. They said it like a warning. Someone claimed the Kettles believed in keeping blood untainted because it bound them to something older than God, something that promised them life without end if they paid the price. By the time the sun went down that night, every porch light in town was burning, every door locked, and every mother telling her children the same thing: don't ever go near the Kettle place, not even in daylight, because some roots go deeper than graves. The librarian, Mrs. Norrie, had worked in the town's archives for nearly 40 years, long enough to know where every birth, marriage, and death certificate was supposed to be. She'd seen names come and go, families grow and disappear, but the Kettles had always been an odd gap in the paper trail. When the local police came asking if she had any record of a girl named Ruthie Kettle, maybe born sometime in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, she expected to find at least something. Every child born in that county was supposed to have a record, no matter how remote their home. But when she opened the old steel drawer labeled K, there was nothing. No Ruthie. No infant death certificate. No baptism. No school enrollment. It was as if she'd never existed at all. Mrs. Norrie didn't like things that didn't add up. She went further back, digging through yellowed pages and brittle family registries. The Kettle family appeared again and again, handwritten entries that grew shakier with each generation, but the line ended abruptly with a man named Jebediah Kettle and his wife, Marnie. After them, nothing. No children listed, no deaths recorded, no movement at all. Just silence. She checked the census from that year, but the Kettle farm wasn't counted. It was as if the family had simply refused to be seen. Curiosity became something heavier as she kept searching. She found a note buried in an old church ledger, a scrawled entry from a visiting reverend who'd been asked to perform a blessing at the Kettle property but never made it past the gate. His handwriting shook. Asterisk family declined baptism. Spoke of purity, of keeping her hidden until the Lord decides. Asterisk that was the last line before the ink trailed off. Mrs. Norrie tried calling the state office to see if any midwives had recorded a birth in that area around that time, but the woman on the other end hesitated before saying the Kettle name. After a pause, she lowered her voice and said there was one unregistered home birth noted by a county nurse who'd been sent out after reports of a sick child. The nurse never returned. Her report ended with a single line: asterisk infant not fit for record. Asterisk. The fluorescent lights above flickered as Mrs. Norrie closed the file drawers. The silence in the library thickened, the kind that feels like it's listening. She thought she heard a soft hum near the back shelves, a child's lullaby without words, but when she turned, the aisles were empty. She left the lights on that night, the first time she'd ever done so in 40 years, the folder drawer still slightly open where the missing name should have been. The photograph surfaced in the strangest way. Sheriff Connolly found it tucked between 2 pages of an old property ledger while going through the town's evidence archives. It was black and white, taken decades ago, the paper warped and stained by damp. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a family portrait, the Kettles, standing in front of their house. There were 5 of them, arranged stiffly in a row, each face long and unsmiling. The father stood tall, his shoulders squared as if bracing against something unseen. The mother clutched a small Bible against her chest. 2 boys, maybe teenagers, stood on either side, both with the same narrow eyes and sloping foreheads that marked the family line. In the center, between them, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, though something about her face made that uncertain. Her head was tilted slightly, her mouth stretched into what might have been a smile, though it bent wrong, too wide, too full of teeth. One of her eyes looked cloudy, the other sharp and lightless. Sheriff Connolly didn't notice her right away. It was the deputy, young and new, who pointed it out, not the girl herself, but the reflection behind her. In the window of the house, directly over her shoulder, was another face. Smaller, paler, eyes black as oil, staring straight at the camera. When the sheriff turned the photo over, there was a single word written on the back in faded pencil. *Ruthie. No date, no signature, just the name. He brought it to Mrs. Norrie the next morning, asking if she recognized anyone in it. Her hands trembled before she even looked. She said she remembered that house, remembered seeing it from the road when she was a child, but she swore there were never 5 people in that family, only 4. She was certain. The little girl in the center, the one with the strange eyes, had never been part of any photograph she'd seen before. They studied it under a magnifying lamp, hoping to see some trick of exposure, a double image, anything that could explain it. But the light only made it worse. The girl's grin seemed to widen under the glare, her eyes catching the shine like wet stones. And that face in the window, the small one no one could account for, had sharper edges now, clearer lines, as if the longer they stared, the more it wanted to be seen. The sheriff set the picture face down on the desk, but even through the paper, he swore he could still feel her looking at him. The first sound came from the Miller place, a half-mile east of the old Kettle property. Mrs. Miller said she woke to what she thought was a child crying somewhere out in the fields. It was faint at first, just a soft, broken wail that rose and fell with the wind. She thought maybe it was a fox, or one of the neighbors' kids fooling around, but the sound didn't move the way it should have. It stayed in one place, near the fence line, repeating every few minutes like a recording stuck on the same note. When her husband went out to check, the night was still, the air heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't come yet. He said the crying stopped as soon as he reached the edge of the property, and then something else started, a slow, wet scratching, like fingers dragging through mud beneath his boots. By morning, other neighbors were talking about it too. The McKinnons, who lived across the ridge, said they'd heard something pacing in their yard around 2 a.m., soft footsteps circling the house, followed by that same quiet sobbing. Even the dogs refused to bark. A few people joked that it was just raccoons or stray cats, but the laughter didn't last long. Every night the sound came back, always from the same direction, drifting up from the Kettle backyard. When Sheriff Connolly went out to investigate, he found the old wooden cross behind the lilac bushes half collapsed, the soil around it disturbed again. He swore it looked like something had been pushing upward, clawing through from underneath. The ground was slick and uneven, the kind of soft that holds shape when stepped on. He knelt down and pressed his ear close, half out of duty, half out of morbid curiosity. For a moment, there was nothing but the whisper of insects and the hum of the wind through the trees. Then, so faint he thought he imagined it, came the sound of breathing. Not deep, not labored, just slow, steady, like someone sleeping under the earth. That night, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. The air felt charged, and the lilacs, though long dead, carried a sickly sweet scent no one could explain. The scratching started again just after midnight, louder this time, closer, coming from beneath the soil. Those who lived nearby swore they heard a voice under the crying now, something small and fragile repeating the same word over and over, muffled by dirt and distance, *Mama*. They found the last surviving Kettle in a care home 2 towns over, a man with skin so thin it looked like parchment and eyes that watered when the lights were too bright. His name was Silas, though on the admission papers it was just written as S. Kettle, and he never corrected it. He'd been there for years, mostly quiet, talking only to himself or to the nurses when he forgot where he was. When Sheriff Connolly came to visit, carrying the faded photograph and a list of unanswered questions, Silas didn't seem surprised. He looked at the sheriff, smiled a crooked smile that showed more gum than teeth, and said, "You heard her, didn't you?" before anyone mentioned the girl's name. At first, Connolly thought he was confused, but Silas's voice sharpened as he spoke. He said Ruthie had been born wrong. Not sick, not crippled, *wrong*. He said her mother went into labor early, in the middle of a storm that lasted 3 days, and that when Ruthie came out, The midwife screamed and dropped her. She weren't dead, Silas said. She just didn't make sense. He wouldn't say what that meant. He only kept repeating that their blood had gotten thin from too much sameness, that the Kettles had been keeping it pure for too long, and that Ruthie was the result, a child made of everything that shouldn't have been. He spoke of strange things that happened after she was born, milk curdling overnight, crops rotting from the inside, dogs howling at the house but never crossing the yard. The family tried to hide her, locked her in a small room beneath the floor where the light couldn't reach. Sometimes, he said, she sang. Her voice didn't sound like a child's, didn't sound like anything human. Her mother fed her through a crack in the boards until the night the singing stopped. That's when they decided to bury her. It wasn't out of hate, Silas said softly. We just didn't want her to wake up angry. When Connolly asked him if Ruthie was really dead, Silas went still. His eyes rolled toward the ceiling, unfocused, as if listening to something far away. Then he began to laugh, dry and broken. She ain't dead, Sheriff, he said. She just sleeps when it's cold. Always did. She'll be up when it's warm again. The nurse came in then, saying it was time for his medicine, but Silas wouldn't take it. He kept staring out the window toward the woods, whispering the same thing under his breath, * she remembers who buried her star. The order to exhume the grave came 2 days after Sheriff Connolly's visit to the care home. The department couldn't ignore the complaints anymore, the cries, the digging sounds, the missing pets. They brought in a small crew and a county coroner, though none of them seemed eager to touch a shovel. The air that morning hung heavy with fog, and the ground around the lilac bushes was so soft it nearly swallowed their boots. The wooden cross marking the grave had fallen flat, its edges eaten away by rot. No one spoke much. The sound of metal hitting dirt was enough. At first, it was just soil and roots. The deeper they went, the more the air changed, the damp smell of earth giving way to something older, sourer, like meat left too long in the sun. The coroner kept glancing at his watch, muttering that the grave wasn't deep enough to be official. Someone wanted her close, he said, more to himself than anyone else. When the first piece of wood appeared, dark and swollen from years underground, everyone stopped. It wasn't a coffin in the traditional sense, more like a box hastily nailed together, boards uneven and splintered. Connolly crouched beside it, brushing the dirt away with his hand. There was a moment of stillness, the kind that hums just before something breaks. The coroner gave a nod, and they pried the lid open. The smell that came out was thick and metallic, but beneath it was something stranger, faintly sweet, like lilacs blooming out of season. Inside the box, there was no body. No bones. No remnants of clothing. Just a few tufts of black hair tangled in the corner and long, deep scratches raked across the inside of the wood. The marks weren't random, they were deliberate, almost rhythmic, as if made by hands trying to count time. One of the deputies swore he saw movement in the soil under the box, a slight shifting as if something had just withdrawn deeper into the ground. Connolly didn't believe him, not out loud, but he felt it too, a vibration through his boots, a slow pulse beneath the dirt. The coroner ordered the site closed immediately, his face grey and shining with sweat. As they backed away, a gust of wind swept through the lilac bushes, carrying a sound that made every man freeze where he stood. It wasn't the wind, not exactly. It was a breath, soft and low, rising from the empty hole. And though the grave was open and hollow, the earth above it seemed to swell, as if something beneath had only just begun to stir. The first thing to vanish was a sheep from the Hargrove farm, then another the following night. By the end of the week, 3 goats and a dog were gone too. There was no blood, no drag marks, no signs of a predator. The animals were simply missing, their pens left open as if someone or something had quietly unlatched them from the inside. Mr. Hargrove found strange impressions near the fence, not quite footprints but not animal tracks either. The prints were small, deep, and oddly spaced, as though whoever made them didn't walk the way a person should. The sheriff blamed coyotes, though even he didn't sound convinced when he said it. Then came the sightings. Children whispered about seeing a girl in the woods at dusk, pale as the moon, standing just beyond the tree line. She never moved when they called out, only tilted her head and stared until the light faded. One boy swore she was humming a low, tuneless sound that made his teeth ache. Another claimed her mouth didn't open when she spoke. The parents dismissed it as campfire talk until one mother found her daughter sleepwalking toward the woods, barefoot, whispering the same name over and over. Ruthie. By the third week, no one went outside after dark. Dogs cowered in corners and refused to eat. Windows that had stayed open all summer were nailed shut. The smell of lilac began to drift through the valley again, too early for the season, thick and cloying even when the air was cold. People said it came from the Kettle property, carried on the wind like a warning or a lure. A few brave or foolish teenagers went out there one night to see for themselves, but only 2 came back. The third was found by dawn, lying in a ditch with a look of pure terror frozen on his face, his hands and mouth packed with dirt. The surviving boys told the sheriff they'd heard singing before it happened. Not loud, but close, so close it seemed to come from under their feet. They said they saw her then, standing by the lilac bushes, her hair matted with soil, her eyes reflecting the flashlight like glass. She didn't chase them. She just smiled and whispered something they couldn't understand, her voice layered, like 2 people speaking at once. When they ran, she followed for a few steps and then stopped, pressing her hand into the ground. The earth shifted under them, breathing, pulsing, as if answering her touch. That night, the whole valley went still again, but the lilacs bloomed darker, their scent heavy as decay. When the Kettle property finally went up for sale, it didn't stay on the market long. The real estate agent called it a piece of forgotten history, and the pictures online made it look almost peaceful, the slanted porch softened by wildflowers, the distant hills golden in the morning light. The new owners were a young couple, Mark and Evelyn Barlow, looking for quiet after years in the city. They didn't know the stories, or if they did, they laughed them off as rural superstition. The neighbors didn't say much when the moving truck arrived, just watched from behind their curtains as the Barlows carried boxes into a house that hadn't known laughter in decades. For a while, everything was fine. Evelyn loved the stillness, the sound of crickets at night, the way the stars seemed closer here. But the quiet began to change after the first month. She started waking in the early hours, certain she'd heard footsteps just outside the window light, slow steps that stopped whenever she turned on the lamp. Mark told her it was the house settling, or deer moving through the brush, but even he flinched when the smell of lilacs began to creep through the vents. It was autumn by then, long past blooming season. When Evelyn found out she was pregnant, the doctor said it was early but healthy. The news should have been joy, but something about it felt heavy, strange. She started craving things she couldn't explain: cold water, clay, soil. Mark would find her outside at dawn, barefoot in her nightgown, crouched by the lilac bushes, her hands buried in the earth. When he tried to pull her away, she looked at him with eyes that didn't quite seem like her own and said she was just listening. One night, he followed her quietly. She went to the backyard again, the same spot where the grass grew uneven over the old grave. The air shimmered faintly around her, and when she knelt down, the ground seemed to pulse beneath her palms. Mark swore the soil shifted, parting like breath. Evelyn whispered something, her voice soft and melodic, though he couldn't make out the words. When she stood up again, her hands were black with dirt, her expression calm, almost serene. From that night on, she slept deeply and dreamt of a girl she'd never met. A pale child with long black hair who smiled without moving her lips. The baby inside her kicked whenever the dreams came, as if answering something older than either of them. Winter came early that year, wrapping the valley in a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The Barlows spent most nights inside by the fire, trying to ignore the strange tapping that sometimes echoed through the floorboards. Mark said it was pipes freezing, but Evelyn knew better. The noises had rhythm, like someone knocking from underneath. When she pressed her ear to the floor, she swore she heard a faint humming, the same melody that haunted her dreams. The lilac bushes outside stayed green even as frost claimed the rest of the garden, their scent thicker than ever, seeping through the cracks in the old window frames. By spring, the house began to change. The walls seemed to sweat, the wallpaper curling away to reveal faint markings underneath, long vertical lines scratched deep into the wood. Evelyn grew pale and quiet, her belly round and hard. She said she could feel movement even when the baby wasn't kicking, a slow shifting deep inside, like something stretching in its sleep. Mark started hearing it too, especially at night, the scraping, the soft thud of dirt falling somewhere below. He tried to laugh it off until the basement door began to open on its own. During renovations, Mark decided to seal off the crawlspace under the house. When he pulled up the floorboards, he found a narrow tunnel leading down into the earth, packed tight with cold, damp air. The smell hit him first, sweet, rotten, familiar. He followed the tunnel with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark until it caught something pale ahead. It wasn't stone or bone at first glance, but dozens of small, curved shapes, ribs, hands, skulls no bigger than apples. The nest spread out in a circle, woven from roots, hair, and fabric. In the center of it all was a figure, small and hunched, its skin the color of ash, its chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sleep. Evelyn's voice came faintly from above, calling his name. When he turned back toward the light, the ground behind him shifted. The figure's eyes opened, not fully, just enough for a thin gleam to slip through the dark. It smiled, a twitch of lips that seemed to stretch too far, and whispered something in a voice like Evelyn's own. Mark stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. When he looked up toward the opening, Evelyn was there, kneeling at the edge, her hands pressed to the dirt. She was smiling too, her eyes calm and glassy, as the soil began to collapse between them, pulling everything back down where it belonged.